September 12th, 1941. 200 hours. Kharkov Locomotive Factory, number 183, Ukrainian SSR. The noise inside Shop 15 is a physical entity. It beats against the chest, a deafening rhythmic concussion of steel slamming into steel. The air is thick with the acrid stench of ozone, vaporized cutting oil, and the sulphurous breath of the smelting furnaces. Here, in the sprawling, soot-stained heart of the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, there is no day or night. There is only the quota. Sparks rain down in glowing waterfalls as welders fuse the angled, heavy steel plates of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secret, the T-34 medium tank. Standing on an iron catwalk high above the assembly line is Yuri Maksarev, the director of Factory 183. His face is pale beneath a layer of factory grime, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of sleeplessness. He watches the massive overhead cranes lower a V2 diesel engine into the hull of a nearly completed tank. It is a masterpiece of brutalist engineering. But as Maksarev watches the steel beast take shape, the vibration he feels in his boots isn't just from the drop forges below. It is coming from the west. Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, is 82 days old. The German Wehrmacht is not just winning, they are annihilating everything in their path. The Red Army has lost millions of men in massive encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk. Right now, General Heinz Guderian's panzer groups are closing the trap around Kiev, just 250 miles away. Once Kiev falls, the road to Kharkov, the industrial crown jewel of Ukraine, will be wide open. A young telegraph operator, breathless and clutching a piece of decoded paper, clatters up the iron stairs to the catwalk. He hands the message to Maksarev. The director unfolds it. The order bears the stamp of the GKO, the State Defense Committee, and the signature of Joseph Stalin himself. Maksarev reads the brief, terrifying text. He is a man who deals in the hard, immutable laws of physics and metallurgy. He builds machines that weigh 30 tons. But the words on this paper defy all logic. The order is not to fight. The order is to pack up. Maksarev is instructed to cease production, dismantle the entirety of Factory 183, load it onto railway flat cars, and ship it to the Ural Mountains, deep in the Asian interior of the Soviet Union. He has roughly 2 weeks before the German vanguard reaches the city limits. To call this an evacuation is a gross understatement. Factory 183 is not just a building, it is a sprawling industrial metropolis. It covers hundreds of acres. It contains 10,000 complex machine tools, massive hydraulic presses that weigh up to 100 tons, gigantic electrical generators, and a labyrinth of furnaces, foundries, and chemical baths. To move it is like being told to carefully dismantle the island of Manhattan, put it in a box, and rebuild it in the Mojave Desert, all while a hurricane is bearing down on you. Maksarev looks down at the factory floor. 30,000 men and women work here in grueling shifts. They are producing the only weapon capable of stopping the German panzers if Factory 183 falls into German hands, or if it is destroyed, the Soviet Union loses its primary source of armour. The war will be over. "Stop the line," Maksarev says to his chief engineer, who has just joined him on the catwalk. The engineer stares at him, horrified. "Director, we are 20 tanks behind quota for the week. If we stop the line, the NKVD will have us shot for sabotage." "Stop the line," Maksarev repeats, his voice tight. "Kill the furnaces, drain the oil. We are moving." Down on the floor, the impossible begins. The shrill scream of the factory whistle cuts through the roar of the machinery, signalling not a shift change, but the death of the factory. Slowly, the thunder of the drop presses stutters to a halt. The grinding wheels spin down into silence. The roar of the furnaces diminishes to a low, hungry hiss. For the first time in a decade, Factory 183 is quiet. The workers, machinists, welders, teenage apprentices, and seasoned foremen gather on the shop floor, looking up at the catwalk in confusion and rising panic. Rumours of the German advance have been whispered in the bread lines, but the state propaganda has continuously promised that the Red Army is holding firm. The sudden silence of the machines tells them the terrifying truth. The state is running. Maksarev climbs down to the floor. "Comrades!" he shouts, his voice echoing in the sudden, unnatural quiet of the cavernous hall. "The fascist invaders are approaching Kharkov. We will not leave them a single bolt. We are taking the factory with us. You will unbolt your machines. You will grease the parts. You will pack them into crates. The motherland needs these machines in the east." Panic ripples through the crowd. Moving the machines is one thing, but what about their homes, their families? "You and your families will board the trains with the equipment," Maksarev continues, masking his own terror with bureaucratic authority. "We leave nothing behind." The reality of the Council for Evacuation's master plan is staggering. It is not just Factory 183. Across the entire Western Soviet Union, from Leningrad down to the Black Sea, the same order is being read aloud. An entire continent's worth of heavy industry, over 1,500 major factories, is preparing to pull up its roots and flee 1,000 miles east to the frozen wastelands of the Urals, Siberia and Kazakhstan. But saying it and doing it are two entirely different things. A foreman approaches Maksarev, his face smeared with grease. He points toward the massive foundry at the far end of the complex. "Director, the blast furnaces. The steel inside is molten. If we turn off the heat, it will cool and solidify inside the brickwork. It will crack the furnace wide open. It will be ruined." Maksarev looks at the glowing, towering structures of the foundry. The foreman is right. You cannot simply switch off a steel mill. "Then we blow the brickwork," Maksarev says coldly. "We salvage the steel casings and the burners. Leave the bricks. We'll make new ones in the Urals." Outside the high windows of the factory, the wail of air raid sirens begins to rise over the city of Kharkov. The Luftwaffe has arrived to probe the defences. The dull thud-thud-thud of anti-aircraft guns begins to rattle the glass in the window panes. The timeline has just accelerated. They don't have 2 weeks. They might only have days. The men and women of Factory 183 grab their heavy steel wrenches, crowbars and blowtorches. They turn back to the machines they have tended for years, not to operate them, but to dissect them. The great steel autopsy of the Soviet industrial heartland has begun. And outside, the thunder of the German artillery is getting louder. September 15th, 1941, 14:30 hours. Shop 12, Kharkov Locomotive Factory, number 183. The sky above the shattered skylights of Shop 12 is no longer the crisp blue of early Ukrainian autumn. It is a bruised, suffocating canopy of oily black smoke. Just 3 miles away, the Luftwaffe's Heinkel He-111 bombers are methodically turning the residential districts of Kharkov into rubble. Inside the cavernous assembly hall, the air is thick with brick dust and the panicked shouts of thousands of workers. But there is no time to seek shelter. The evacuation quota handed down by the State Defence Committee demands that 3,000 train carloads of equipment must be shipped eastward before the week is out. Standing in the centre of the chaos is foreman Pyotr Ivanovich, a man whose hands are permanently stained black with industrial grease. He is staring up at his nemesis, a massive 75-ton German-built Schuler hydraulic drop press. For 5 years, this iron titan has stamped the heavy steel suspension components of the T-34 tank. It is the beating heart of Shop 12. And now, Pyotr has been ordered to rip it out of the ground. To understand the sheer madness of this task, one must look at how the press was built. It wasn't simply placed on the floor. Its foundation was poured 10 feet deep into the solid concrete of the earth, secured by steel anchor bolts the thickness of a man's thigh. In peacetime, moving a machine of this scale would take a team of specialised engineers, heavy lift hydraulic jacks, and 3 months of careful planning. Pyotr has a team of 30 exhausted workers, a pair of acetylene torches, hand-cranked winches, and exactly 48 hours. "The nuts are fused, Pyotr," shouts a young worker named Galina, her face smeared with soot and sweat. She is 16 years old, wearing a pair of men's canvas overalls that pull around her ankles. The able-bodied men of Kharkov have already been conscripted and sent to the front to bleed in the mud. The staggering, back-breaking labour of tearing down the Soviet industrial empire has fallen almost entirely to women, teenagers and old men. Pyotr wipes his forehead with a filthy rag. He walks over to the base of the press. The massive hexagonal nuts securing the machine to the concrete have been chemically welded to the bolts by years of rust, vibration and heat. "We don't have time to unscrew them," Pyotr growls, grabbing a heavy acetylene torch from a nearby rack. "Turn up the gas, we cut them." He ignites the torch. The blue-white flame roars to life, instantly raising the temperature in the immediate vicinity. Pyotr kneels in the oil-soaked dirt and presses the blinding tip of the torch against the base of the 2-inch thick steel nut. The metal begins to weep, turning a dull cherry red, then a blinding, incandescent orange. Sparks cascade over Pyotr's heavy leather apron. The stench of vaporized rust and burning machine oil is nauseating. For 20 agonizing minutes he holds the flame steady, his arms trembling from the weight of the torch, until the thick steel finally yields, sloughing away in a shower of molten slag. 1 bolt down, 7 to go. Across the sprawling complex of Factory 183, this scene is repeated 10,000 times over. It is an act of organized, desperate vandalism. Men and women are using sledgehammers to smash the brickwork around the massive annealing furnaces. They cannot wait for the heavy refractory bricks to cool, so they wrap their faces in wet rags to avoid inhaling the searing 500-degree air as they swing their hammers, tearing the ovens apart to salvage the irreplaceable alloyed steel burners and heating coils within. But detaching the machines is only the first impossible hurdle. The second is getting them out of the buildings. Many of the heaviest lathes and presses were installed before the factory walls and roof were even built. They are simply too wide to fit through the heavy iron doors of Shop 12. Director Yuri Maksarev marches onto the floor, flanked by an officer of the NKVD, the feared secret police. The officer carries a clipboard, but his right hand rests pointedly on the leather holster of his Tokarev pistol. The state is watching. Sabotage or delay is punishable by execution. "Director, the Schuler press won't clear the loading bay doors," Pyotr shouts over the din, pointing to the massive iron archway. "It's too wide by half a metre." Maksarev doesn't even blink. "Then take down the wall, Pyotr." Pyotr stares at him. The wall supports the roof trusses. If we knock out the masonry, the roof might collapse. "If the Germans take that press, the motherland collapses," Maksarev replies, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Knock down the wall, rig timber shoring for the roof, get the machine to the rail yard." The order is given. Teenage girls like Galina are handed heavy iron crowbars and pickaxes. They attack the brickwork of the factory they practically grew up in. The air fills with choking red dust as the masonry crumbles. Every swing is fueled by a terrifying cocktail of adrenaline, exhaustion, and the echoing boom of the German 105mm howitzers, which are now close enough to rattle the fillings in their teeth. When the wall is finally breached, a gaping hole is opened to the grey, smoke-filled sky. Now, the 75-ton press must be moved. With no heavy tractors available, the workers rely on ancient, brutal physics. They wedge massive wooden timber rollers beneath the base of the severed machine. Thick, braided steel cables are wrapped around the iron chassis and run out through the breached wall to hand-cranked winches staked into the frozen mud of the courtyard. "Have!" Pyotr roars, his voice cracking. 50 women and old men throw their meagre body weight against the winch handles. The cables pull taut, singing a high, dangerous note under the extreme tension. If a cable snaps now, it will whip through the crowd with enough force to cut a human body in half. The winches groan, the timber rollers creak, the wood splintering under the immense, crushing weight of 75 tons of German iron. Slowly, agonizingly, the Schuler press inches forward. It moves a foot, then another. It is like watching a pyramid being built in reverse, powered entirely by sheer, terrified human will. As the machine breaches the factory walls and rolls into the courtyard, the sheer scale of the evacuation becomes terrifyingly clear. The courtyard is a sea of wooden crates, tens of thousands of them stretching as far as the eye can see. Every single loose component, every wrench, Every spare gear, every electrical spool, every blueprint must be catalogued and packed. But the logistics of reassembly pose a terrifying puzzle. If they simply throw the parts into crates, the factory will be impossible to rebuild in the Urals. It will be a jigsaw puzzle of 1 million pieces dumped into the snow. To solve this, Maksarev's engineers have devised a desperate, primitive coding system. Paint is requisitioned from every warehouse in the city. "Red paint for shop 12, a foreman yells, distributing buckets and thick brushes to a line of exhausted children. "Blue paint for the foundry, yellow for the engine assembly." Every component of the Schuler press is smeared with a thick stripe of red paint, followed by a hastily scrawled number. Red-12- press-A1. The matching bolts, which Galina has painstakingly collected in a heavy canvas sack, are labelled Red-12-press-A1- bolts. The system relies on the hope that whoever opens these crates 1,000 miles away, in the dark and the snow, will be able to match the colours and the numbers before the frostbite takes their fingers. Suddenly, the shrieking wail of an air raid siren reaches a fever pitch. "Incoming!" someone screams from the rail yard. A shadow sweeps over the courtyard. 3 German Junkers, Ju-87. Stuka dive bombers break through the cloud cover, their inverted gull wings unmistakable against the smoke. The terrifying mechanical scream of their Jericho trumpet sirens paralyzes the workers for a fraction of a second. Then, the world explodes. A 250-kilogram bomb detonates at the edge of the rail yard. The shockwave throws Pyotr to the ground, showering him in frozen mud and razor-sharp shrapnel. A geyser of fire and pulverized concrete erupts into the sky. Pyotr scrambles to his feet, his ears ringing with a high, sustained whine. He looks toward the blast. A section of the rail line has been obliterated, but miraculously, the flatbed cars waiting to receive the Schuler press are still intact. The NKVD officer is already on his feet, waving his pistol in the air, his face smeared with dust. "Do not stop. Get back to the winches. Keep moving." There is no time to mourn the dead. There is no time to cower in the trenches. Pyotr grabs the winch handle, his hand slipping on his own blood from a shrapnel cut on his forehead. Galina takes the handle beside him, her face a mask of pure, white-hot terror. They lean into the wood. The cables sing. The 75-ton press inches closer to the train. They are tearing down their Titans, loading them onto a fleet of iron flat cars that stretch out of the city like a massive, rusted steel spine. The great exodus of Soviet industry is about to begin its 1,000-mile journey into the frozen unknown, and the cost of the ticket is blood, sweat, and absolute desperation. October 4th, 1941. 23:15 hours, 200 miles east of Kharkov, the Soviet railway network. The rhythm of the rails is a slow, agonizing dirge. Clack, 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 clack. Train number 10,452 is not a passenger locomotive. It is a rusted, soot-stained iron serpent crawling through the pitch-black Russian steppe. It stretches for nearly a mile, a Frankenstein's monster of flat cars, coal tenders, and dilapidated wooden boxcars. The locomotive, an ancient Class E steam engine, belches thick black smoke that immediately freezes in the biting autumn air, raining down as gritty, toxic snow. On the reinforced flat cars just behind the engine, the Titans of Factory 183 ride in state. The 75-ton Schuler press, stripped of its foundations and lashed down with thick steel cables, is covered by a heavy, ice-stiffened canvas tarpaulin. Beneath the tarp, the hastily painted red letters, Red-12-press-A1, are the only guarantee that this massive hunk of iron won't become useless scrap metal at the end of the line. Behind the flat cars are the Teplushki, the standard Soviet wooden boxcars. In peacetime, a single Teplushka was designed to carry either 40 men or 8 horses. Tonight, boxcar number 7 is carrying 64 human beings. Foreman Pyotr Ivanovich sits with his back against the freezing wooden slats of the wall. He draws his thin, grease-stained jacket tighter around his chest. The air inside the car is a suffocating fog of unwashed bodies, exhaled breath, and the acrid smoke leaking from a burzhuika, a tiny makeshift iron stove huddled in the centre of the floor. Across from him, 16-year-old Galina is asleep, her head resting on a canvas sack filled with the greasy steel bolts from the drop press. She is shivering violently. The Russian winter has arrived a month early. Outside, the temperature has plummeted to -10 degrees Celsius, and the wind cutting through the cracks in the boxcar feels like razor blades. This is the reality of the Great Evacuation. It is not a clean, orderly relocation. It is an exodus of sheer, unadulterated human misery. The Soviet railway system is in a state of catastrophic overload. Over 1.5 million railway cars are currently in motion across the country. They are funneling through a handful of narrow, antiquated tracks, heading east toward the Urals, Siberia and Central Asia. The logistical nightmare is compounded by the fact that traffic is moving in two directions. While the ghost trains of heavy industry crawl eastward to safety, trains packed with fresh doomed Red Army conscripts are desperately speeding westward to plug the collapsing front lines at Moscow and Leningrad. Suddenly, the brakes of train 10,452 screech with a deafening metallic wail. Piotr is thrown forward as the boxcar violently shudders and jolts to a halt. The Bolshevika stove nearly tips over, spilling glowing red coals onto the wooden floor. Panic erupts in the darkness. "Fire! Watch the coals!" someone screams. Piotr scrambles on his hands and knees, ignoring the blistering heat as he scoops the embers back into the iron belly of the stove with his bare, calloused hands. The heavy sliding door of the boxcar is suddenly yanked open from the outside. The freezing wind howls in, bringing with it the harsh glare of a flashlight. An NKVD officer stands in the snow beside the tracks, the collar of his heavy greatcoat turned up. A submachine gun is slung across his chest. "Out!" he barks, his breath pluming in the harsh light. "Able-bodied men and women, out! We have a blockage." Piotr drags himself to his feet, nudging Galina awake. They climb down from the boxcar, their boots sinking ankle-deep into the fresh snow. The scene outside is apocalyptic. They are stopped in the middle of a dense, snow-covered birch forest. 2 miles ahead, the red glow of a fire illuminates the low-hanging clouds. A westbound troop train has derailed, its locomotive lying on its side like a slaughtered beast. The tracks are twisted and torn, blocking the only arterial route to the east. "The Luftwaffe hit the line 3 hours ago," a railway engineer yells, running past with a heavy iron pry bar. "If we don't clear the track before dawn, the bombers will return and finish us off." The workers of Factory 183, machinists, engineers, and teenage girls are handed shovels, pickaxes, and lengths of chain. They march forward into the freezing night. When they reach the wreck, the true horror of the war slaps them in the face. The troop train is a twisted ruin of splintered wood and crushed metal. Moans of the dying drift from the wreckage, but the NKVD guards are merciless. "Leave the dead! Clear the tracks!" the officer roars, firing a burst from his submachine gun into the air. Any delay is sabotage against the state. For Piotr and Galina, the next 6 hours are a blur of frostbite and agony. Without heavy cranes, they must use the sheer force of human numbers to drag the shattered train cars off the rails. They wrap chains around the smouldering debris and heave, their boots slipping in the bloody, frozen mud. The skin on Piotr's hands cracks and bleeds, the blood freezing instantly to the iron chains. They are starving. The daily ration on the ghost trains is exactly 400 grams of bread, a hard, dense brick mixed with sawdust to make it go further. Water is acquired only when the train stops, by scooping snow into buckets and melting it over the Bolshevika. Dysentery and typhus are already spreading through the cramped boxcars, leaving a trail of shallow graves buried in the snowbanks at every siding. But they do not stop pulling. They know that the flat cars idling behind them hold the very survival of their nation. If the Schuler press and the T-34 engine lathes don't make it to the Urals, the German panzers will eventually roll into Red Square. By 0500 hours, the sky begins to lighten into a bruised, pale grey. The tracks are finally clear, hastily repaired with sledgehammers and replacement iron ties dragged from the rear of the train. "Back to the cars," the whistles blow. Piotr practically carries Galina back to Boxcar 7. She is completely exhausted, her lips blue from the cold, As the locomotive builds steam and the train jerks forward with a metallic groan, Pyotr looks out through the slatted wooden walls. They are approaching a massive dark expanse. The tracks lead onto a sprawling, heavily guarded iron bridge. Beneath them flows a river of churning, black, ice-choked water. It is the Volga River. Crossing the Volga is a profound psychological threshold. As train 10,452 rumbles over the iron trusses, Pyotr realizes they are leaving the continent of Europe behind. They are crossing into the vast, unforgiving expanse of Asia. The industrial heart of the Soviet Union has been excised from its chest, put on life support, and is now being dragged into the wilderness. For 2 more agonizing weeks, the train crawls eastward. The landscape changes from the rolling steppes of Russia to the jagged, imposing foothills of the Ural Mountains. The temperature drops further, hitting -20, then -30. The snow is no longer a dusting. It is a permanent, blinding white ocean. Inside the boxcar, the workers huddle together for warmth, their faces hollow, their eyes deadened by the rhythmic clack of the rails. They have survived the Luftwaffe. They have survived the derailments. They have survived the starvation. Finally, the train begins to slow. The brakes squeal, echoing off the frozen rock faces of the mountains. Through the wooden slats, Pyotr sees a sprawling valley floor, completely buried in deep snow. There are no buildings, there are no factories, there is only a desolate, windswept clearing framed by dense pine forests. A signpost beside the tracks, coated in ice, reads, Nizhny Tagil. The doors slide open. The freezing wind hits them like a physical blow. The NKVD guards step into the snow. Unload the flat cars, the order rings out. Pyotr steps down into the knee-deep snow, staring at the empty, barren wasteland. He looks at director Maksarev, who has emerged from the command car, his face grey with fatigue. Director, Pyotr whispers, his breath freezing in the air. Where is the factory? Maksarev looks out at the empty, howling wilderness. He turns back to Pyotr, his eyes cold and hard. You are standing on it, Pyotr. Now get the machines off the train. They have arrived in Tankograd, and the hardest part of the miracle has not even begun. November 2nd, 1941, 0600 hours. Nizhny Tagil, the Ural Mountains. To call the temperature cold is a failure of language. At -40 degrees Celsius, the air itself feels weaponized. It burns the lungs with every drawn breath. Moisture freezes on eyelashes instantly, gluing them shut. If a worker takes off their canvas mitten and touches the bare iron of a machine tool, the moisture in their skin flash freezes to the metal, tearing the flesh away down to the muscle when they pull back. Foreman Pyotr Ivanovich wraps a filthy, torn scarf over his nose and mouth, his breath immediately forming a crust of white ice on the wool. He stands knee-deep in the virgin snow of the Ural Valley, looking back at the line of flat cars. "Ropes!" he shouts, his voice swallowed instantly by the howling wind sweeping down from the mountain peaks. "Get the ropes around the base." The unloading process is a grotesque mirror of the dismantling in Kharkov. There are no cranes waiting for them. The sprawling complex that will eventually be known to the world as Tankograd is, at this moment, nothing more than a designated grid of wooden stakes driven into a frozen pine forest. 16-year-old Galina, shivering so violently her teeth chatter like a telegraph key, grabs a thick hemp rope. She lines up with 40 other women, their faces hollow, their eyes deadened by the weeks-long nightmare journey. They wrap the ropes around the base of the 75-ton Shula hydraulic drop press, still bearing its blistered red-painted code, RED-12-PRESS-A1. They heave. The timber rollers, salvaged from the train ride, groan against the flat car. Slowly, agonizingly, the titanic piece of machinery is slid down a makeshift ramp of reinforced logs, crashing into the snowdrift with a heavy, muffled thud that shakes the frozen earth. All around them, the scene is a chaotic, sprawling junkyard of the Soviet war effort. Thousands of machine tools, lathes, drill presses, milling machines and welding rigs are being dumped directly into the snow. The sheer scale of the displaced metal is mind-bending. Director Yuri Maksarev marches through the snowdrifts, a heavy sheepskin coat draped over his shoulders. He holds a rolled-up blueprint, stiff as a board in the cold. "Pyotr!" Maksarev calls out, pointing to a patch of empty, snow-covered ground marked by 4 wooden stakes. "Shop 12 goes here. Get the press into position." Pyotr stares at the empty space, then looks up at the sky. Thick grey clouds are unleashing a heavy blizzard. "Director, we have to wait for the sappers to lay the foundations and the walls. We can't leave the machines exposed to the snow. The lubricating oils are frozen solid. The gears won't turn. It's like trying to operate a machine made of solid glass." Maksarev steps closer. His eyes are red-rimmed, carrying the weight of the daily telegrams from Moscow. The Wehrmacht is at the gates of the capital. The Soviet winter counter-offensive is desperate for armour. "Pyotr," Maksarev says, his voice cutting through the wind like a razor. "There are no walls. There is no roof. The bricks haven't even been fired yet. We are not waiting." Pyotr looks at him in disbelief. "Operate in the open, in a blizzard? Director, the cold will crack the cast iron the second we apply stress, and the oil." "Then light a fire under it," Maksarev barks. "I don't care if you have to burn your own boots, Pyotr. The tanks must be built. The motherland is bleeding to death. Build the tanks first. The walls can wait." The order defies every rule of mechanical engineering, but in the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941, engineering has been replaced by sheer fanatical survival. Pyotr turns back to his crew. "You heard him. Clear the snow. Fetch wood from the tree line." Galina and the other teenagers plunge into the pine forest, dragging dead wood, branches, and anything that will burn back to the clearing. They dig a trench directly beneath the massive iron chassis of the Schuler press. They pile the wood high and douse it with a precious cup of kerosene. A match is struck. The flames roar to life, hungrily licking the frozen black iron of the machine. It is a surreal, hellish vision. Across the sprawling white valley, hundreds of bonfires are lit. The snowfield looks like an ancient pagan encampment, but instead of idols, the fires are worshipping towering steel machines. The black smoke rises into the blizzard, choking the workers as they huddle around the flames for warmth. Slowly, the frozen glass-like lubricating oil inside the Schuler press begins to thaw. It drips, thick and viscous, onto the snow. The red paint, the lifeline that brought them here, blisters and blackens in the heat. But Pyotr's warning about the foundation remains. A 75-ton drop press cannot simply sit on top of snow. When it stamps steel, the kinetic energy will drive the machine straight down into the dirt, misaligning the dies and ruining the parts. It must be anchored. "Dynamite!" Pyotr yells to a nearby sapper crew. The ground beneath the snow is permafrost, dirt and rock, frozen so solid it is indistinguishable from concrete. Pickaxes simply bounce off it, sending jarring shocks up the workers' arms. The sappers drill deep holes into the frozen earth and pack them with ammonal explosives. Boom, boom, boom. The muffled explosions throw geysers of frozen mud into the air. The workers rush in with shovels, clearing the jagged craters before the earth can freeze solid again. They maneuver the heavy machines over the craters and drop them in. Instead of pouring a traditional concrete foundation, which would freeze and shatter before it cured, they mix the cement with boiling water and heavy concentrations of salt, shoveling it frantically around the anchor bolts before the winter can kill the chemical reaction. For 3 days and 3 nights, the work does not stop. Men and women drop from exhaustion, falling asleep in the snowbanks. If they are not kicked awake by the foreman or the NKVD guards, they freeze to death where they lie, their bodies covered by the relentless snowfall. The dead are dragged to the edge of the forest. There is no time or energy to dig graves in the permafrost. November 6, 1941. 1800 hours. The machines are anchored. The fires are burning. But a factory needs a heartbeat. It needs power. There is no power plant in Nizhny Tagil capable of running a massive industrial complex. Maksarev's solution is as brutal and improvised as everything else. Several ancient coal-fired steam locomotives have been driven off the main rail line and parked directly in the snowfields. Heavy, rubber-coated electrical cables are spliced directly into the train's massive generators, snaking across the snow like black veins, plugging directly into the machine tools. Piotr stands by the control panel of the Schuler press. He looks at Galina, who is holding a heavy, red-hot blank of alloyed steel with a pair of long iron tongs. She has just pulled it from a makeshift annealing furnace built from salvaged bricks and mud. "Power on!" Maksarev shouts from across the clearing. The locomotives whistle, their smokestacks belching towers of black soot into the blizzard. The massive generators whine, the pitch rising higher and higher. Suddenly, the control panel of Piotr's machine lights up. The electrical current surges through the frozen cables. "Clear!" Piotr yells. He throws the heavy iron lever. The Schuler press, a machine that was stamping steel in the warm comfort of a Ukrainian factory just 6 weeks ago, groans. The massive hydraulic ram, coated in thawed smoking oil, rises into the air, exposed to the swirling snow. Galina steps forward, her muscles trembling under the weight of the tongs. She slides the glowing orange hot steel blank onto the lower die of the press. The heat radiating from the metal fights a desperate localized war against the -40-degree air. Snowflakes hiss and vaporize the instant they touch the glowing steel. Piotr pulls the lever down. With a deafening, earth-shattering crack, the 75-ton ram slams down onto the steel. The ground shakes violently. The shockwave rattles the teeth in Piotr's skull. The ram lifts. Sitting on the die is a perfectly stamped suspension arm for a T-34 tank. Galina stares at it. Piotr stares at it. A ragged, exhausted cheer ripples through the freezing workers huddled around Shop 12. It worked. Against all laws of nature, logistics and engineering, the ghost factory has been resurrected. All across the valley, the symphony of heavy industry begins to play. Lathes scream as they cut cold-rolled steel. Arc welders flash blinding blue light into the blizzard, illuminating the falling snow like a strobe light. They are building tanks in the snow. As the workers assemble the massive hulls, bricklayers finally arrive, beginning to hastily slap walls together around the active, roaring machines. Carpenters balance on icy wooden scaffolding high above the sparks, trying to nail a wooden roof over the assembly line. But the machines do not wait for the roof. The production line moves. The steel exodus has survived the journey, and the vengeance of the Soviet Union is about to be unleashed. December 5th, 1941, 0400 hours, Nizhny Tagil, the Ural Mountains. The blizzard has finally broken, leaving behind a sky of fractured, glittering stars and a temperature that has plummeted to an unthinkable -45 degrees Celsius. In the clearing that was once a quiet pine forest, the skeleton of Shop 12 now stands. The brick walls are only half built. The wooden roof is missing massive sections, leaving the factory floor open to the cosmos. But the silence of the forest has been permanently eradicated. Inside the freezing, roofless structure, a mechanical beast is waking up. It sits at the end of the crude, snow-dusted assembly line, a jagged silhouette of angled steel. Foreman Pyotr Ivanovich stands back, his breath hanging in the frozen air. His hands are wrapped in dirty rags. He has lost the tip of his left pinky finger to the freezing iron of the Schuler press, snapped off like a dry twig when his glove tore 2 weeks ago. Beside him stands Galina. She is unrecognizable from the girl who lived in Kharkov. Her face is gaunt, coated in a permanent layer of soot and machine oil, her eyes hollowed out by starvation rations and 18-hour shifts. But right now, those eyes are locked on the machine they have just built. "Prime the cylinders," a mechanic shouts from the engine deck, his voice barely cutting through the din of the surrounding lathes. Inside the cramped, freezing hull of the tank, a driver engages the compressed air starter. Hiss, chunk, 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 roar. The V2 12-cylinder diesel engine detonates into life. A massive plume of thick black exhaust shoots from the rear pipes, instantly melting the snowbanks behind the vehicle. The ground shakes, not from the drop presses this time, but from the raw, vibrating horsepower of a 30-ton Predator. This is the first Ural-built T-34 medium tank. It is a brutally ugly machine. There was no time to grind down the weld seams. They look like thick, jagged scars across the sloped glacier's plate. There was no time to install headlights, radios, or leather-padded seats. There wasn't even time to paint it. The tank is rolling off the line in its raw naked state, a patchwork of dull grey cast iron, oxidised red steel, and grinding, ungreased tracks. It is a weapon stripped of every single vanity, reduced to its absolute lethal essence: a gun, an engine, and armour. Director Yuri Maksarev walks down the line. He doesn't look like a bureaucrat anymore. He looks like a warlord in a sheepskin coat. He slaps the freezing, unpainted steel of the tank's flank. "Load it," Maksarev orders. There is no ceremony. There is no bottle of champagne smashed against the hull. The driver grinds the heavy transmission into first gear. With a shrieking metallic clatter, the wide steel tracks bite into the frozen earth. The T-34 lurches forward, driving straight out of the roofless factory, through the snowdrifts and directly onto a waiting flat car on the newly laid rail spur. Pyotr and Galina watch it go. They don't cheer. They don't have the energy. But as the tank's engine idles on the train car, a profound, heavy realization settles over the exhausted workers. The trains that brought their dismantled world 1,000 miles east are now turning around, and they are not going back empty. December 6th, 1941. 8 o'clock hours. Khimki, 18 miles from Red Square, Moscow. 1,000 miles to the west, the war has reached its terrifying climax. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the German 2nd Panzer Army, looks through his binoculars at the frozen wasteland outside Moscow. Through the optical glass, he can just make out the glint of the golden domes of the Kremlin. They are so close. A few hours' drive. But the German war machine is dead. The weather that the Soviets endured in the Urals has reached the front lines. The temperature sits at -35 degrees. The highly refined, synthetic lubricating oil used in the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks has frozen solid, turning to a useless paste. Their engines will not start. If they try to force them, the engine blocks crack. The narrow tracks of the Panzers have sunk deep into the snowdrifts, leaving them immobile, frozen monuments to a failed blitzkrieg. German soldiers are freezing to death in their summer uniforms, their optical sights frosted over, their machine guns jammed by ice. They are waiting for the final, desperate Soviet collapse. German intelligence has assured the High Command that the Soviet Union has no reserves left. Their factories in the West were captured or destroyed. The Red Army is bled white. Then the earth begins to tremble. It starts as a low rumble on the eastern horizon. Through the driving snow, the German sentries hear a sound they have never heard before: the high-pitched metallic squeal of wide, ungreased steel tracks, combined with the deep, throaty roar of thousands of diesel engines. Out of the whiteout they emerge, not dozens, not hundreds, but an avalanche of armour. Fresh, raw, unpainted T-34 tanks, entirely unaffected by the brutal cold. Their wide tracks allow them to float over the deep snowdrifts where the German panzers sank. Their aluminum block V2 diesel engines, designed by men and women who just survived the freezing hell of Tankograd, roar in the sub-zero air without missing a beat. Their sloped armour deflects the desperate frozen anti-tank rounds of the German defenders. Riding on the back of the tanks are the fresh, heavily winterized troops of the Siberian reserves. But the tanks themselves are the true miracle. Guderian lowers his binoculars, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. He realizes in a single, terrifying instant that German intelligence was fatally, catastrophically wrong. The Soviets didn't lose their factories. They moved them. The Red Army counter-offensive at Moscow shatters the German lines. The invincible Wehrmacht is thrown back in disarray, abandoning their frozen vehicles, running for their lives from the relentless tide of crude unstamped steel pouring out of the east. The miracle of Factory 183 is not an isolated incident. Deep in the interior, across the Urals, Siberia and the Volga region, the ghost trains have all arrived, and the seeds of a new industrial empire have been planted in the snow. In Chelyabinsk, the relocated tractor factories are churning out massive KV-1 heavy tanks. In Kuibyshev, workers who evacuated from Moscow are building Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft in unheated hangars, producing them, as Stalin demanded, like bread, like air. By the end of 1942, The relocated Soviet factories will outproduce the entire continent of Nazi-occupied Europe. Germany, with its untouched factories in the Ruhr Valley, its precision engineering and its captive slave labour force, will build 6,000 tanks that year. The Soviet Union, operating out of roofless sheds, freezing mud and permafrost, using a workforce comprised largely of starving women, teenagers and old men, will build 24,000. It is a victory of sheer bloody-minded resilience. The Nazis built a military machine designed for perfect conditions. The Soviets built a military machine designed to survive the apocalypse. May 1945, Berlin. 3.5 years later, a T-34 tank crashes through the rubble of the German capital. Its tracks grind over the swastika banners, fallen in the dust. The tank is scarred, battered and coated in the grime of a 1,000-mile march from the gates of Moscow to the heart of the Third Reich. Deep in the Ural Mountains, the news of the German surrender reaches Nizhny Tagil over a crackling radio broadcast. The sprawling complex of Factory 183, now fully enclosed with brick walls, steel roofs and proper heating, falls silent. The deafening roar of the Schule drop presses finally stops. Pyotr Ivanovich, his hair entirely grey, steps away from his machine. He wipes his grease-stained hands on a rag. He looks across the factory floor at Galina. She is 20 years old now, a master welder, her face lined with a maturity that belies her age. They do not cheer, they do not dance. The cost of the victory is too high. Millions are dead. Their homes in Kharkov have been reduced to ashes. The starvation, the frostbite, the relentless, bone-crushing terror of the last 4 years has hollowed them out. But as Pyotr looks at the silent towering iron of RED-12-PRESS-A1, the machine they dragged through the snow, the machine they lit on fire just to keep the motherland's heart beating, he feels a quiet, immovable pride. History will remember the generals who drew the arrows on the maps. It will remember the marshals who commanded the fronts and the politicians who signed the treaties. But the war was not won in the map rooms of the Kremlin. It was won in the mud of Kharkov, on the freezing flatcars of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and in the roofless, snow-swept clearings of the Ural Mountains. It was won by the mechanics, the teenage girls, and the foremen who looked at the impossible physics of a dying nation, grabbed their wrenches, and moved a 1,000-mile mountain of steel with their bare, bleeding hands.